Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. This is Skylar Baker Jordan, for those of you who don't know. And today we're going to be talking about Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988. And if that sounds boring to you, you're wrong. Section 28 is actually a really interesting law, and it's a very important law in the history of gay rights in the UK. It was passed in 1988, as the title of the law probably indicates to you. And now's a really good time to be looking back at Section 28, not only because February is LGBT History Month in the UK, but also because we've just had this wonderful new series by Russell T Davies called It's a Sin, which focuses on gay men, the AIDS epidemic in 1980s Britain. So this is a really good time. Everyone's kind of already thinking about gay people in the 1980s. And so I thought we'd go ahead and look at this really important law that really sort of served as a catalyst for the modern gay rights movement as we understand it. So let's go ahead and get started right now. So for those of you not familiar with Section 28, you're probably asking what this piece of legislation is even about. It's the Local Government Act, but it's about gay people? Well, as you can probably imagine from the title, the Local Government Act encompassed a whole lot of things. Section 28 was just one small part of it, but it was probably the most important part because it was the most controversial part. And what Section 28 did, as you can see in the text here on the screen, and I just pulled this straight from the British government's website, it prohibited the intentional promotion of homosexuality and prevented the publishing of material with the intention of promoting homosexuality by local councils, by schools, and it banned the promotion or the teaching in any maintained school, which was basically any sort of state school, or in the United States, you might call them public schools, of the acceptability of homosexuality as, quote, a pretended family relationship. So it was a very anti-gay law. It was designed to be very anti-gay. We'll see later that it was designed in response to some very specific incidents, some very specific books. And we're going to take a look kind of at the atmosphere of 1980s Britain in relation to gay rights and the sort of public opinion of homosexuality. As you can imagine, it is influenced a lot by the AIDS epidemic. We're going to touch on that. But there are some other things going on as well that I think it's worth looking at. But what you really need to know from this slide is just what Section 28 did, and that is that it banned the promotion or the teaching of homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle. That was the essence of the law. So we're going to go ahead and continue now. So you can't talk about Britain in the 1980s without talking about Maggie. Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister for the entirety of the 80s. She was first elected in 1979. She didn't leave office until 1990. So we're going to talk a little bit about Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher is mostly noted for her economic philosophy and her economic and labor reforms, but there was a moral component to Thatcherism as well that is incredibly important to look at in regards to Section 28. It is a reassertion of the nuclear family as the primary social unit. Now, Thatcher is famously known as a champion of the individual, but she really thought that the family, not the individual, but the family, the nuclear family, was the primary building block of society. And a lot of her policies, especially her social policies, were focused on empowering families. But her definition of a family was very, very narrow. It included a married man and a married woman, mom and dad, and 2 or 3 kids. It did not include gay people, and we're going to see that. It was a return to the values that had made Britain great in the 19th century, these Victorian values, with an emphasis on gender roles and an emphasis on repressing sexuality. Margaret Thatcher was very famously not a feminist. She did not support other women necessarily. She famously pulled the ladder up behind her, as the phrase goes, and she didn't promote a lot of women in her cabinet or in her government. She famously enjoyed being surrounded by men and being the only woman in the room. So Margaret Thatcher is one of those figures that is a little bit of a hypocrite when it comes to this, I think, because she achieved really amazing feats and heights and made history as the first female prime minister. But she was someone who really, really had this very narrow traditional idea about what a woman's role was in society and about the family. So she didn't get to focus a lot on social issues, though, because she was focused in the first half of her premiership mostly on economic reforms, labor reforms. These include reforms to unions and the coal industry, which of course precipitated the miners' strike, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But by 1987, she had won her third term, and she was moving forward in implementing moral reforms that she thought were as crucial as her economic reforms. She'd had a lot of success. She'd achieved a lot of what she had come into office to achieve, and now she was able to move on to some other pressing issues in her mind. You get an idea of Thatcher's sort of moral philosophy and this pivot more towards moral reforms and social issues in a speech she gave in 1988. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, as it is called, is Thatcher's, it's one of Thatcher's most famous speeches, and she gives it to the Church of Scotland in May of 1988. Now, this is a speech that is given 3 days before Section 28 is due to become law and to go into effect. So it's already been passed by Parliament, and the law goes into effect 3 days after the Sermon on the Mount. You can find the entire speech, either a recording of it, like a video, or you can find the text of it online. It's all out there. It's a very famous speech, but I'm just going to pull one quick quote from it. The basic ties of the family, she said, are at the very heart of our society and are the very nursery of civic virtue. So that really speaks to what Margaret Thatcher thinks of as in terms of the most important institution in society. And it's not the individual. The cornerstone, the building block of society is the family. And of course, that family, she says, the very nursery of civic virtue, that family includes children. And so that is what Section 28 is about in the minds of the members of Parliament who introduced it, in the minds of the people who supported it, including the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And so it's about protecting the family. It's about protecting children. And you get an idea of this from a speech that she gave in 1987 at the Conservative Party conference, when she said that children need to be taught to respect traditional moral values, but they are being taught instead that they have, quote, an inalienable right to be gay. So not a fan of the gays. And I included a video in this PowerPoint in order for us to watch together her give that speech, but unfortunately it's not working. So I'm going to go ahead and put a link to her giving that speech down below. You can go ahead and check it out on your own. So let's talk about gay people. We talked about Maggie, now let's talk about the gays, my people. All right, so we're going to talk about gay Britain in the 1980s because I think it's important that we have an understanding of what was going on culturally within the gay community, within the gay rights movement, but also in broader society. The first thing I want to talk about is the Bermondsey by-election of 1983. Now, Peter Tatchell was the Labour Party candidate, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard of him. Peter Tatchell is still a very famous, albeit controversial, left-wing figure, and he was openly gay, but the Labour Party actually required him not to state his homosexuality. I don't know how much good that did, considering everyone, it was widely known that Peter Tatchell was gay. He was not exactly out. There you have Peter Tatchell. He says he's going to give the Tories nightmares. He certainly did that. And here you have a gay news editorial that shows the headline that this was the most homophobic by-election of our times. And it really was. It's remembered for the conservative and liberal homophobia. But the reason I want to talk about it is because the left was fractured too. And it was fractured between two different types of socialism. There was the more populist socialism that was seen as characteristic of the working class. It was probably the more traditional labor socialism. And there was a more cosmopolitan socialism, which Tatchell was seen to represent. Now, not all of this was down to homophobia. Some of it was xenophobia. Tatchell was born in Australia, raised in Australia, immigrated to the UK in the 1960s in order to avoid the Vietnam draft in Australia. This engendered a lot of anger and resentment from a lot of traditional sort of working class labor supporters and labor figures. They saw Tatchell as not being quote unquote local because even though he was white, even though he was of English descent, and most importantly, even though he actually lived in the constituency, he wasn't English born. And so you have a lot of xenophobia at play on top of homophobia. So the homophobic attacks came from the left as well. Simon Hughes, who was the Liberal candidate, he ended up winning that election, served in Parliament for about 20 years, more than 20 years. He and Tatchell would eventually make up, and Simon Hughes himself would come out as bisexual in the 2000s. Now, AIDS. We're going to talk a little bit about AIDS, but we're not going to talk a lot about it. And the reason we're not going to talk a lot about it is because, it's not the primary focus of this video, but you cannot talk about Britain in the 80s without talking about AIDS. But the other reason we're not going to talk too much about it is because you can go and watch It's a Sin and get a really good idea about what the AIDS crisis did to the gay community in the 1980s. It's such a wonderful program. I really hope you'll check it out if you haven't already. So, the AIDS crisis, and this is sort of touched on in It's a Sin, at first there was some optimism that it wouldn't affect Britain, that it would be contained to the United States, which is where the cases were seen to be originating. Of course, we know now that it didn't originate in the United States, but at the time, most of the cases that people knew of were there. Particularly New York, San Francisco. But in 1982, Terrence Higgins became the first British person to die of AIDS. If you recognize the name Terrence Higgins, it's because the Terrence Higgins Trust bears his name today. Now, the conservative government was slow to act. They didn't really know what to do, I think, if in all fairness. I mean, this was a very, very new disease. No one really understood it when it first emerged. But the fact that it was really sort of making itself manifest and known in the gay community, it was infecting and affecting the gay community more than anyone else, really contributed to the government's slow action. In 1987, they did produce a flyer, though, that they put through the letterbox of every British home. AIDS, don't die of ignorance, it says, as you can see here. And that's sort of indicative of the government's sort of policy on AIDS. They mostly stoked fear. There wasn't a whole lot of education. And so gay people suffered, but so did other people in the AIDS crisis. And again, go check out It's a Sin. Now, there was a study that Ken Livingstone, who is a name you probably recognize as well because he was the mayor of London from 2000 to 2008, and he continues to be a very prominent left-wing, far-left activist, much to the chagrin, I think, of the labor right, but that's a conversation for another day. But he quoted this gay teenage study group in the debate in Parliament over Section 28, and the findings were quite startling. 3 out of 5 gay teens in the 1980s in London had been verbally abused, this study found. 1 in 5 had been physically assaulted, and 1 in 5 had attempted suicide. Now, all of this, the homophobia of the Bermondsey by-election and the AIDS epidemic, combined to see a declining level of acceptance over the 1980s as evidenced by the social attitude surveys. Now, these social attitude surveys were done periodically throughout the 1980s, possibly later, though I'm not sure, and they really reflected a decline in acceptance of homosexuality. It was at 62% in 1983, it had gone up to 74% in 1987. So we see that the gay community in Britain is being vilified and targeted, particularly by the right-wing press, but also by the government, and that seems to be working. So we've seen that there were declining levels of acceptance for gay people in the UK in the 1980s. How did the gay community react to this? How did it organize to combat homophobia? How did it organize to address the AIDS crisis? These are the questions that we're going to get to now, and we're going to see if we can answer them. The gay rights movement in the 1980s was fractured. The 1970s had seen a fracturing of the burgeoning movement that had really started at the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s. and the feminists, lesbians, and the gay men kind of went their separate ways. A lot of lesbians complained about gay male misogyny within the movement, and they found that they had more in common with their feminist sisters, particularly after the British feminist movement stopped being homophobic or as homophobic and started to address lesbian issues as part of the broader feminist agenda. Now, there had been some coordination in the early 1970s, as we talked about, but by the end of the decade, they had largely gone their separate ways. Lesbians were moving into feminist circles or other left-wing causes, such as the campaign for nuclear disarmament. We see here a photo of a nuclear disarmament march. I believe this was in 1983, but I'm not sure on that date. It was the 1980s, though. And you can see that it's led by a lot of women. Now, obviously, I don't know if all of those women are lesbians or if any of them are lesbians, but women were very, very involved in the peace movement and in nuclear disarmament. That was one of the causes that attracted a lot of energy on the left in general in the 1980s. Now, part of this fracturing is natural in a way because gay men and lesbians at the time didn't necessarily see that they had a common agenda or that their interests were necessarily aligned. Lesbian sex had never been criminalized in the UK. Which means that they really didn't have any stake in earlier efforts to decriminalize homosexuality, male homosexuality. And a lot of them took a lot of issue with sort of the misogyny that they saw in the gay community and the gay movement, as well as some of the overt sexualization that they saw going on in the gay community. The LGBT community, as we understand it, just did not exist yet, and that is really important to understand. Before 1988, there really was no notion of the LGBT community. For example, founded in 1985, the London Lesbian and Gay Center actually excluded bisexuals. They excluded some other people as well, including gay men who practiced S&M, but eventually the S&M folks were allowed into the Lesbian and Gay Center, but bisexuals were still excluded. Now, AIDS brought lesbians and gay men back together. I was going to say we see this in It's a Sin, but I don't actually know if Jill's a lesbian. But either way, it brought lesbians and gay men back together. Lesbians began taking on the very important work of caring for gay men and advocating on behalf of gay men who really a lot of times could not advocate for themselves because they were too busy, living through this collective trauma. So lesbians really picked up the brunt of caring for their gay brothers, and that is something that should be remembered. Now, there was also some internecine warfare on the left, as we've talked about. There were some real divisions, including from the hard left militant and the Labour Party proper. Now, we see that these divisions continue to this day. They have reasserted themselves in the 2010s and the 2020s. We're not going to talk too much about that right now, but it's worth noting. But there were also, as we talked about earlier, some divisions between the more traditional working class left and what was considered the metropolitan elite of the Labour Party, the Peter Tatchells, the Ken Livingstones, that were seen as taking on more and more of the identity politics issues and less of the class politics issues. It was an attempt, I think, by Ken Livingstone and by Peter Tatchell and others to reconcile a class-based socialism with the pressing identity issues of the time. I mean, gay rights was something that desperately needed addressing, but strictly speaking, it wasn't a working class issue. And in fact, a lot of working class people at the time, particularly within the Labour Party, kind of saw homosexuality as being a middle class sort of bougie issue, not something that was salt of the earth and that was germane to the working class. Not all working class people, but a lot of them. And I think that that's very important to stress. Now, this starts to change around the mid-'80s, and you have this group formed during the miners' strike, which you can look at more about the miners' strike if you want. I'm not going to go into the why-fors and wheres of why that strike came to be, but the important thing to know is that the miners did go on strike and that a group formed to help them. It was called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. Now, there's this beautiful film done about this organization called Pride. It came out 7 or 8 years ago, and I encourage you to watch that. But what you need to know for now is that there were a group of lesbian and gay activists that were led by Mark Ashton and Mike Jackson. And what they did is they went around Pride one year in 1985, and they started collecting money for the striking miners. It might have been 1984, sorry. But they were a group of lesbian and gay activists. They weren't the Labor Party proper. They weren't an organization like Stonewall, which would not come into existence until later. They were just a group of grassroots activists. Now, they circumvented the system because they knew that there was a lot of stigma attached to homosexuality. And so they bypassed the National Union of Mine Workers, and instead they gave their money directly to a small Welsh village. Now, here you have a pamphlet for their Pits and Perverts benefit. They raised a lot of money. They raised thousands and thousands of pounds. And this movement was crucial to building support in the unions and therefore the Labor Party itself for gay rights. And because of a block vote from the National Union of Miners, which had been supported by LGSM, the Labor Party committed to advancing lesbian and gay equality in 1985. Now, it was a fairly milquetoast commitment by modern standards, but it was historic in that the Labor Party was committing to advance LGBT equality, well, lesbian and gay equality, and committing to end discrimination against lesbian and gay people. Now, LGSM, like I said, it was a watershed moment in the history of gay rights within the Labor Party, and it really helped to bring the issue of gay rights to a broader consensus within the left and to a broader audience within the left. So that brings us up to 1987. And 1987 is important because it is the year we see the first attempt to introduce a bill that is akin to Section 28 that would really prohibit the teaching and promotion of homosexuality by local councils and by local schools. There are three key players in this movement. One is Dame Jill Knight. There she is in the House of Lords many years later. Dame Jill Knight was a conservative member of parliament, and she really was concerned with children, as we're going to see, particularly with children being taught that they could be gay. David Wilshire was another conservative MP. He's the one who introduced Section 28 in 1980, at the end of 1987. And then Lord Halsbury. Lord Halsbury, there he is, I believe, in the 1960s. Lord Halsbury was a member of the House of Lords, obviously, and he was the Earl Halsbury, and he introduced the first attempt at passing Section 28 into law, or it wasn't Section 28 then, it was a different bill, but it was essentially, it had the same purpose as Section 28. But his bill was not met with government support, and in fact died when Margaret Thatcher called the 1987 general election. Now, Dame Jill Knight, like I said, was incredibly concerned with children. And if you look at Hansard, you can go back and you can see these debates unfold. And Dame Jill Knight said, and I quote, "There was evidence in shocking abundance that children in our schools, some as young as 5 years, are frequently being encouraged into homosexuality and lesbianism." Important to note, I think, that homosexuality and lesbianism are the same thing. Lesbianism is just female homosexuality, but I don't think Dame Jill knew. Now, she was concerned particularly with 3 books that she cited as evidence of the promotion of homosexuality. One was The Milkman is on His Way. There you have it right there. It's a copy of the book I found on Amazon. You can still buy this book. And it is about a young man struggling with his sexuality. But the crucial detail here is that the book, as she told the House, describes sexual relations between the 16-year-old protagonist and an adult. Now, in the United States today, that would still be controversial because the age of consent is 18 in most jurisdictions. In the United Kingdom, the age of consent today is 16. However, in 1987, it was not, if you were gay. If you were gay, the age of consent was 21. Straight people and lesbians, the age of consent was 16. It is equalized in the UK now, but that came later. The next book she was upset about was The Playbook for Kids About Sex. there you have it. It was published by Sheba Feminist Press. The book is about puberty, and it's about gay people, and it's about lesbians. And I think this book would actually probably still engender some controversy in 2021, simply because whenever you are talking about sex and children, people get very, very touchy, and they are very, very concerned very, very quickly. Now, I'm going to stop here and say I am not advocating one way or the other as to whether a book like this is appropriate for kids. I'm going to leave that up to you to decide. I am just stating that I think there are a lot of people who would be very, very upset by a book like this. The Tories actually bought a large number of copies to warn of the dangers of this book, the playbook for kids about sex, and to keep it from falling into children's hands. However, Sheba Feminist Press was very grateful for the generous purchase and the money that the Conservative Party gave them. The third book that Dame Jill was concerned about, and this is the one that really captured the public attention, is Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. And we're going to talk more about that in the next slide. So Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin is, I think, a fairly innocent children's book, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at it and why it was controversial in 1987, 1988. Now, it tells the story of this young girl being raised by two dads. You can see some of the photos there in the background. You can read a little bit of the text. Knight depicted the book as, quote unquote, a pile of filth. And she claimed that it showed, quote, a little girl of about 6 in bed with her father and his lover, both of whom are naked. Now, if that was true, I would agree that that is very controversial, way over the line, and completely inappropriate. It's not true. It's a total mischaracterization of the book. And you can see here the pages that Jill Knight was talking about. There are Eric and Martin. They are shirtless in bed with their daughter. You know, a lot of fathers around the country in the 1980s and including today would be in similar positions, whether they were gay or straight. They walk around without the shirts. And that is mostly accepted by society. You have images down there of Eric and Martin again in bed. There is Jenny. But nothing I think that is too exploitative, nothing that I think is too inappropriate, nothing I think that would have batted an eyelash if it had been a dad and a mom in bed together with their child. So in the autumn of 1986, parents in Haringey start to burn this book. This book had been available in a teacher resource center in Haringey, but it hadn't really been available to students at all. So that's important to note. Now, Lord Halsbury proposed a bill that would become the prototype for Section 28. We talked about that, but it did not have government support at the time. Then the 1987 election happened. The Tories ran in part on a platform that attempted to paint Labour as a party that would indoctrinate children into homosexuality. And they really played up the trope of the loony left. So, for example, you have this campaign advertisement that came out of Haringey of Betty Sheridan. And Betty Sheridan was a concerned mother. And she said in the ad, quote, "If you vote Labour, they will teach my kids about gay and lesbian people instead of giving them a proper education." Okay, except Betty Sheridan's children were privately educated. So that kind of shows you the level of outrage here. You know, Betty Sheridan had no real stake in this. This was not about her children. This was about gay people. And the Tories won that election and were emboldened. And so Jill Knight and David Wilshire resurrect Lord Halsbury's bill as Clause 28 of the local government bill, this time with Thatcher's blessing. And so, how did gay people respond to Section 28? How did lesbians respond to Section 28? Well, that's what we're going to talk about now. And it's really, really interesting and very important because here you see a coalescing of movements that would become what we understand as the gay rights movement today. So I'm going to go ahead again. Sorry about that. These videos do not work the way that I want them to work. So we're going to go ahead and skip them. But I will include links to them down below. So let's talk about organizing against Section 28. Well, we start to see unity emerge between lesbians and gay men because they finally have a common cause. Now, keep in mind, again, that lesbians didn't have a stake in the legalization of male homosexuality, and that they didn't really see that they had a lot of the same issues that gay men had. They really started, threw their lot in with the feminist movement, with nuclear disarmament, and with the peace movement. And so you start to see a coming together of lesbian and gay organizations. However, or not organizations, but people. However, the old fault lines between the reformists and the liberationists that existed prior to the 1980s still exist in the 1980s. So part of what did the gay rights movement in, and even if you're just talking about gay men in the 1970s, was that there wasn't a unity of purpose. The reformists wanted to achieve equality within the system. The liberationists wanted to blow the system up. And you still see this on the left, I think, today, with sort of hard left versus soft left versus centrist factions within the Labor Party. But it certainly was the reality of the gay movement in the 1970s and into the 1980s. So at a conference in November of 1987, 500 lesbians and gay men met to set up a legislative agenda in anticipation of the clause. They knew it was coming. They knew they needed to do something about it. The problem is they couldn't really agree. Again, the leftists wanted a sweeping social revolution, while the more centrist attendees wanted to negotiate within the system. So they walked away without any agreement, and this schism ultimately led to two different organizations being formed. One was the more radical Outrage that was led and influenced a lot by Peter Tatchell, and one was the more centrist Stonewall organization, which was founded in part by Ian McKellen and others. Ian McKellen famously came out during Section 28. He was not out before then. So in January of 1988, 10,000 people marched through London, opposing Clause 28 as it was then known. And in February of that year, 20,000 people marched through Manchester, becoming the biggest gay rights demonstration in British history up to that point. So you see that this had an incredibly galvanizing effect on the movement. It really brought people out to the streets in a way that we hadn't seen since the early 1970s. People really understood that this was an existential threat to the gay rights movement, and they read this as a assault on the hard-won rights that they had won earlier in the 20th century. Now, lesbians in particular were involved in some very memorable actions. One was abseiling into the House of Lords. They threw these ropes down and climbed down from the gallery onto the floor of the House of Lords, shouting, "Lesbians are angry!" And it's one of my favorite civil actions of civil disobedience that I've ever heard of. And I encourage you to sort of watch the video that I'm putting down below. You can see the news report on that. Another one, they invaded the BBC studio while Sue Lawley was reading the 6 o'clock news. And they started shouting, you know, their protest and their opposition to Section 28. And it's just a phenomenal video to watch because this went out live to the entire nation. And you hear the protests in the background, but you also see Sue Lawley continue to flawlessly deliver the news. It's just a remarkable video. But despite these protests, Section 28 received royal assent in March of 1988, and it became law in May of that year. So what is the legacy of Section 28? We've talked about the run-up to Section 28. We've talked about Britain in the 1980s. We've talked about the law itself, why it came into being, why it was passed, but what are the consequences of it? What's the legacy of it today? Well, one is that you have a generation of school children who grew up lonely and afraid. If you talk to any British lesbian or gay person who came of age in the 90s, they're likely to tell you that this law had a detrimental effect on them, on their mental health, on their view of themselves, on their self-esteem. So the law really had a negative effect on the children that it was intended to protect. However, there were never any prosecutions or sanctions under Section 28. No one ever got in trouble for violating Section 28. What the law did instead was it had a chilling effect on conversations about homosexuality, particularly in schools. And so it made addressing homophobic bullying very difficult. It made addressing the needs of gay and lesbian students next to impossible. And so that's the real legacy of this law. However, there's a silver lining to this cloud. Section 28 really galvanized the movement. It made it coalesce. We saw the biggest gay rights protest in British history up to that point over this. We saw that pride became integrated between gays and lesbians in 1988, something that continued. We saw the formation of Outrage and Stonewall, the latter of which is still the most preeminent gay rights organization in Britain. So we saw that the movement really came together. We also saw that the liberationist elements and the reformist elements were able to form a symbiotic relationship, one that continues really to this day. So the liberationists generated the headlines. They were the ones who made the news. They did the actions like invading the House of Lords or invading the BBC. But the reformists lobbied the government, and they really achieved a lot of the law reforms that we saw over the coming decades. They raised the visibility of lesbian and gay Brits, and this was done because of Section 28. Section 28 really put gay issues on the agenda. It really put the conversation about homophobia and homosexuality firmly in the minds of the British people in a way that it hadn't been for at least 20 years since decriminalization. You had a new civil rights movement that was born and that was placed into the British consciousness. And shows like EastEnders helped further visibility of lesbian and gay Brits. EastEnders famously had the first same-sex kiss in 1987 and the first same-sex kiss on the mouth in 1989, both of which involved Michael Cashman, who was himself very involved in the protests against Section 28. Ian McKellen, like I said earlier, came out because of Section 28, and he helped to put a familiar face to the cause. So you had more celebrities coming out and more people standing up for LGBT rights. Ultimately, Section 28 was counterproductive if you wanted to stop the promotion of homosexuality, because it really put homosexuality into the national conversation in a way that it had never been before. And ironically, it paved the way by making homosexuality something that people were talking about. It paved the way to equalizing the age of consent in the 90s, to eventually repealing itself in the 2000s. Section 28 was repealed in the 2000s, and to eventually marriage equality in the 2010s. So Section 28 really laid the groundwork for a lot of the achievements in gay equality that we saw over the course of the following 20 or 30 years. And this video here, again, I'm going to put the link down below. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be working the way that I would have liked it to. And that's our show. So I hope you learned something. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation on Section 28 and how it galvanized the gay rights movement in the 1980s. It was really a crucially important law in British history, and I think it's one that is poorly understood and poorly discussed today, because a lot of people, I think, focus on gay marriage or civil partnerships as being sort of this milestone law, and they were, but they would never have come about if it wasn't for Section 28 and what it did for coalescing the movement for gay rights and lesbian rights in the United Kingdom. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you'll check out It's a Sin. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. And I hope you'll follow me on Twitter at Skylar Jordan, or check me out on Facebook. Again, I'm the only Skylar Baker Jordan on there. And if you enjoyed this and you like the last video as well, or if you just want to help a brother out, my Patreon is right there, and you can become a patron for as little as $3 a month. And I put exclusive content on there. So I've already made 2 or 3 videos with political commentary. There will be more to come. So I really appreciate it if you can chip in a little. It means a lot to me, and it helps me to continue to make this kind of content. So thank you so much. I really hope you all have a blessed day, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Bye-bye.